Loki has just gotten one of the best villain introductions in One Piece history, but the big question is, who is going to defeat him? Because this isn't as straightforward as most One Piece arcs, where we know who the final boss is far in advance that Luffy is going to eventually defeat. Right now, we have no idea what the actual conflict of Elbaf is going to be. We don't know if Loki will be the main antagonist of the arc, or if there will be an even bigger challenge. We don't know if Loki is going to be a lone wolf, or work hand in hand with other villains. Hell, we actually technically don't even know for certain yet whether or not Loki is even going to be a villain. However, there are a lot of clues and pieces of foreshadowing that can be connected to Loki's character introduction, that actually potentially tie Loki to several different characters that could be his final matchup. Because if we break down the entire cast of characters in the Elbaf arc, as well as characters that are very likely set to arrive in Elbaf, there are 5 individuals with strong arguments for being the ones to ultimately fell this mighty giant. Each one has a promising case, so let's break them down one by one. But before we get into it, make sure to subscribe. And I wanted to ask if you have sleep issues. I personally developed sleep issues starting in my early 20s, where I began having a lot of difficulty just shutting my mind off at night and drifting to sleep. I couldn't really stop the buzzing thoughts in my head, and it became really difficult with any sort of outside noise. So literally any additional stimulus, be that cars outside or pets or people walking around in the halls, all of it would just keep me up because I was so hypersensitive to any sounds. But recently I started using Manta Sleep, the sponsor for this video, and the Manta Sleep mask that they sent me has been by far the best way for me to just shut out all outside stimulus and just let my mind rest. And this isn't just an ordinary sleep mask, it's really meant to be a seamless seal that just turns off everything outside your own brain. Now, I've always avoided sleep masks because I've been worried about them being too tight around my face, but Manta Sleep has special foam padding around the eyes so that I feel zero pressure on my eyes and my eyelids. It just feels natural and comfortable. And then around my ears I can turn on white noise. That's at least my preference. I know some of you might prefer, nature sounds or ambient rain and so on. The Manta Sleep Mask really does make sleeping so much easier for me, and honestly before this I have tried everything. I've tried NyQuil, melatonin, tea, but the biggest thing that this mask does that nothing else can do is turn off all outside stimulus. So I don't have to worry about noises at night waking me up, or dogs, or my laundry machine, or my dishwasher. Everything is just quiet, and falling asleep is really easy. So seriously, if you've had sleep issues, try this Manta Sleep Mask. You can get 10% off with my code MORGE. Just check out Manta Sleep by hitting the link in the description below, and make sure to use your code MORGE to get 10% off your order. So that aside, to begin with, if Loki turns out to be the main antagonist of Elbaf, then this is a very cut and dry discussion. Luffy will be the one to defeat him. This is based on the simple fact that in every single One Piece arc ever, Luffy is the one to defeat the main antagonist. The only exceptions are arcs where the heroes lose, like Sabaody or Marineford, or arcs like Zou and Egghead where the villains are simply delayed to be defeated in a later arc. But in any storyline we have where there is an actual main antagonist that needs to be defeated for real in that arc, Luffy is the one to do so. So if Loki is the main antagonist of Elbaf, Luffy will defeat him, open and shut case. But the question is, will Loki really be the main villain of this arc? While Loki certainly seems like he's going to be an antagonist, it's very difficult to say whether or not he will be the main antagonist. On the one hand, Loki has certainly been introduced with main villain energy. The entire build-up to his introduction and his final grand reveal are certainly up there with some of One Piece's most impactful character introductions ever. Loki is undeniably being written with a tremendous amount of aura, and that's also literal. He literally has an extremely menacing aura. He fits the bill for a main antagonist in most ways, but there are a few things that seem a little bit odd. To begin with, Loki is meeting Luffy remarkably early in the story for a main arc boss. The main villain meeting Luffy at the start of the storyline almost never happens, except for with particularly minor villains. As in all major storylines, there is a significant amount of build-up to Luffy's first encounter with the big bad. Luffy running into Kaido in Act 1 was a twist in Wano precisely because it was so early in the storyline, and even that relatively early encounter only came all the way at the end of the entire act. The quick and casual meeting of Luffy and Loki only 3 chapters in is simply unprecedented in One Piece, and this almost makes it feel like it's too simple for Loki to be the big bad of the entire storyline, and rather there is something more to come. On top of this, Loki lacks any sort of organization underneath him. He has no subordinates or followers or crew that we know of. It's just him, a lone wolf who has already been captured. Luffy's main opponent for the arc is always some sort of a boss figure, with a powerful force underneath them. But Loki isn't the boss of anyone, even if he was freed. As far as we can tell, he's not really set up to play the role of the end-all be-all big bad of the arc without subordinates, as that's why every other story arc involves Luffy needing his crew and his allies to handle all the scores of enemy subordinates before Luffy can take on the main boss. With Loki, that aspect of being the final boss of Elbaf seems to be missing at the moment. Now keep in mind, none of these factors on their own disqualify Loki from being the main villain of Elbaf, of course. Maybe there is a secret coalition of Elbaf giants that will side with Loki if he is freed, or maybe Loki can recruit some new villainous characters to his side. And even if Loki met Luffy surprisingly early in the arc, maybe Oda is just playing with readers' expectations and switching things up. Loki certainly could be the main antagonist of Elbaf. He has the aura of a main antagonist. The point is simply that him being introduced so early and not having any subordinates or resources means it's equally possible that Loki is a red herring, and there will be an even bigger challenge that the heroes will have to face this arc. And if this is the case, if Loki is instead a secondary antagonist in the Elbaf arc, well then it becomes extremely unlikely that Luffy will be the one to defeat him. Luffy is always reserved for the main boss of the arc, and while Luffy does on occasion defeat mini-bosses before his final boss fight in an arc, such as Satori, Bluno, or Cracker, it's generally not that common, and these mini-boss characters usually do not have much build-up or significance placed on them. They're clearly written as stepping stone subordinates and warm-up fights to get to the big bad. However, Loki seems like he has far too much significance, build-up, and power being attached to him at the moment to fit the mold of a traditional mini-boss or small fight for Luffy. Loki is being portrayed almost like Kaido himself. On top of that, Loki very clearly is not a subordinate to anyone else. He is his own individual entity, so unlike most of Luffy's mini-boss fights, Loki wouldn't really be a stepping stone to any main antagonist. If anything, Loki may be more so in the mold of how Big Mom was in Wano. Not the main boss of the arc, but still an extremely powerful, independent, secondary big bad that must also be defeated. So ultimately, with regards to Luffy versus Loki, it comes down to the simple question of, is Loki going to be the main antagonist of Elbaf? If Loki is the main antagonist, Luffy is almost guaranteed to be the one to defeat him. If Loki is not the main antagonist, then Loki is being saved for someone else besides Luffy. And so here is where it gets interesting. If it's not Luffy, then the first character we need to discuss is Zoro. Traditionally, Zoro gets to fight the second strongest enemy, though that has of course become more complicated in recent arcs like Punk Hazard and Wano, where the two strongest enemies were more so portrayed as partners rather than boss and subordinate. And so in both of these arcs, Zoro actually did not get to fight the second strongest. So even if Loki is the second strongest antagonist of Elbaf, that alone does not necessarily mean that Zoro will get to fight him, as again, Loki seems like his own entity. However, there are a few factors that do suggest that Zoro versus Loki is possible, most notably that Loki's character introduction strongly parallels Zoro's character introduction. Both Loki and Zoro are built up as fearsome warriors in advance. Both are established to have an infamous reputation. Both are introduced with an intimidating aura, and both are introduced tied up to a post, with both of them having been sentenced to crucifixion. It really is remarkably similar. Now, it's entirely possible that this is purely coincidental, as across 1100 chapters of introducing characters, at some point Oda is going to make some unintentional parallels. But at the same time, we know that Oda also makes a ton of very intentional parallels. So it is entirely possible that Oda is hinting at something here by making Loki's introduction so similar to Zoro's. And when considering Zoro versus Loki on paper, it would be a very promising matchup, considering Loki is of course an extremely powerful warrior and he wields a weapon, which could make him a naturally fitting opponent for Zoro. And more importantly, to be honest, Zoro is in desperate need of an actually significant high-level opponent extremely soon if he's going to be taking on Mihawk in a couple arcs, because Egghead was just not it whatsoever. If Zoro needs a fittingly strong opponent to level him up in Elbaf and actually get him closer to the level of the world's strongest swordsman, then Loki may have been written in for that very reason. Zoro was also prevented from meeting Loki early on despite expressing interest, which may suggest that Oda is deliberately saving their encounter for later on. Lastly, some readers have even pointed out that it seems like Oda may use a skull mark like seen on Loki's clothing to denote Zoro's opponents, though at the same time that doesn't necessarily seem consistent. However, Zoro isn't the only one of Luffy's subordinates with an argument for taking down Loki. Many readers have also discussed the ultimate dark horse contender, Usopp. Now, while I personally have an extremely hard time imagining Usopp actually defeating a monster like this, maybe that's the point. After all, everyone expects Elbaf to be an important arc for Usopp, one in which Usopp solidifies himself as a brave warrior of the sea. And while Usopp is unlikely to defeat the main villain, it is likely he will get some sort of significant win in Elbaf. And considering how much has been made of Usopp's connection to the Giants, and how important the island of Elbaf is to Usopp, maybe the fight that Usopp gets in Elbaf will be specifically tied to the island itself, a victory where Usopp earns the respect of the Giants, perhaps by toppling the strongest giant of them all. And while Usopp is far, far weaker than Loki, well, the concept for Usopp's character has always been David versus Goliath. A small, normal man taking down enemies far more powerful than him, armed with nothing more than a simple slingshot. Usopp defeating Loki would simply be the ultimate representation of this idea, Usopp truly felling a mighty giant as the endpoint of Usopp's character journey. Now that being said, it's still just really difficult for me to imagine Usopp doing anything at all that might be a factor against someone like Loki. Even Sea Stone wouldn't really be effective considering just how huge Loki is. The quantity of Sea Stone required to actually affect a giant-sized body would just be absurd. And while Usopp does normally punch way above his weight class to win fights, that usually entails Usopp managing to somehow defeat one of the weaker enemies that the Straw Hats are facing in a given arc. Because for Usopp, even the lowest end members of enemy organizations are Herculean challenges for him. I mean, people already have difficulty imagining how Usopp would match up against a third commander like his father Yasopp or someone like Van Augur. And Loki seems to be far above the likes of them. Put it this way, if Loki really is close to Yonko level, or maybe even Yonko level himself, then Usopp defeating Loki would be almost like Usopp soloing Kaido. But at the end of the day, if this is something Oda wants to happen for Usopp's story, if this was the grand endpoint that Oda always envisioned for this character, well, it's not out of the question that David could beat the ultimate Goliath. But now here is an option that is actually my personal favorite because it's a little outside the box. But before we get into it, this spooky season you can get Onigashima, Hachinosu, and Thriller Bark as travel posters for your walls. And in case you missed it, every month we are bringing the entire world of One Piece to life, island by island, with new batches being released every month. So if you want to get this Halloween trio of islands, they are only available this month of October and then never again. But the best part is, with your bundle of posters, you get an invite to join me live on stream to discuss any One Piece topic that you want, and share your One Piece ideas in front of thousands of viewers. Plus, you'll also be able to join me in a smaller, more private group setting happy hour that I'll be hosting online once a month. Plus, you'll get a 20% discount on all other items in the Morge store, and a hand-drawn bookmark, thrown in for free. And finally, with each poster comes a code. The first person to solve the code wins the Great Pirate Race and wins the Grand Mystery Prize, along with being featured as the winner on the channel. You get all of that bundled together with your travel posters. And again, this trio of posters are only going to be printed and produced this month of October and this month only. So hit the link in the description below to get your bundle today. Grab this collection before it's gone. There is one potential protagonist left on Elbaf who is not part of the Straw Hat crew who may be fit to take down Loki. That's right, Captain Kidd is still potentially in play at Elbaf. Because there are only two ways you can look at Kidd right now. Either Oda brought Kidd to Elbaf to abruptly eliminate him from the story and to hype up Shanks, or Oda brought Kidd to Elbaf specifically to force the character to go through some actual development. Now, I've made a full video breaking down why, despite my personal dislike for Kidd's character, it seems like there are actually a lot of signs pointing to Elbaf being something of an arc of growth and redemption for Kidd. Some of the key points are the obvious parallels to Luffy and the Straw Hats' defeat at Sabaody and the growth that came for them out of that, as well as a lot of thematic setup around Kidd's character seemingly always having been foreshadowed to take place in the Elbaf arc specifically from the beginning, as well as Oda planting a connection for Kidd to the Giants of Elbaf in advance by having Kidd defeat the Giants' #1 hated enemy for them. Again, you can watch this video for the full in-depth breakdown, but the point is Kidd's situation is very binary right now. Either Kidd truly has died and has been removed from the narrative, or Kidd is alive and here in Elbaf, and therefore is about to play a significant role in the arc. I don't think an option C exists where Kidd is still alive and at Elbaf, but Kidd has no major role in Elbaf and Oda just put him in the arc for no reason. So if Kidd is not dead, if he is alive here at Elbaf, then who will be Kidd's opponent at the end of his story arc? If this is the stage for some character development for Kidd, then some ending fight or victory is likely set up for him. We know Kidd is not going to defeat Luffy. Kidd is also unlikely to defeat Shanks or Blackbeard considering they both have too much significance left in the story. So the options for who Kidd can reasonably defeat defeat to get a big win at this point are very narrow. Big Mom was really the only throwaway Yonko, and Kid already participated in her defeat. So if Kid's going to get any big 1v1 at this point to progress his story significantly, the only character left that makes sense would be an admiral. But no Marines are ever going to try and go to Elbaf, since that nation is just way too strong for the Marines to ever touch with a 10-foot pole. So Kid, if he is alive in Elbaf and playing a role in Elbaf, needs a significant win by the end of the arc. But Kid has no good options among the Yonko, and the admirals don't really make sense. So what about an island-specific character then? Enter Loki. We've already talked about how Loki may not be the main antagonist of the arc, and so far whenever we've had secondary antagonists, they have gone to one of Luffy's quote-unquote rivals, Law and Kid. We saw this happen in Punk Hazard and Wano with both Virgo and Big Mom. If Loki is set to be the secondary antagonist of Elbaf, well then maybe Loki is set to be defeated by Kid. I think one interesting clue that may suggest this is possible is Loki's introduction. I've already talked about how Loki's introduction parallels Zoro's in terms of the context, but when it comes to the manner of presentation, Loki's introduction most closely parallels Kaido's. Many readers have already discussed how the introductions for those two characters feel remarkably similar, with a lot of exposition building up the character in the pages beforehand, leading up to a huge spread, unveiling the monstrous warrior, specifically framing the protagonists to look tiny in front of them. However, my viewer Cigar Verk pointed out that Loki and Kaido's introductions are also a bit of a reverse, in the sense that Kaido falls down and lands in front of Kid, whereas here Luffy jumps down and lands in front of Loki. Now, Kid never ended up defeating Kaido, even though Kid was used in Kaido's introduction. Instead, Kaido went to Luffy. So maybe this scenario is supposed to be the inverse, in that even though Luffy is being used in Loki's introduction, Luffy is not going to be the one to defeat Loki. This time, it's going to Kid. So this may be an opportunity for redemption for Kid, getting to defeat a legitimately powerful and Yonko-esque enemy in his own right, Loki. If Kid is meant to continue on in the narrative with some sort of a significant role, maybe Loki was a villain created specifically with Kid in mind. And finally, we have one more possibility, which is that Loki may be set up to be defeated by another antagonist, Blackbeard. So why would Blackbeard and Loki be at odds? To begin with, the beauty of the Blackbeard pirates is that it's been established that they are willing to show up literally anywhere that they see opportunity. Be that the forbidden island of Amazon Lily, another Yonko's territory, or even the world government's most valuable island in the middle of a Buster Call. There is genuinely no limit to where the Blackbeard pirates are willing to go, so long as they see opportunity. And Elbaf most certainly has opportunity for them. Namely, Loki's Devil Fruit. That's right, it's very possible that Loki's story ends with him being killed by Blackbeard for his fruit. If that sounds completely random, remember, to begin with, the actual narrative around Loki and Blackbeard is extraordinarily similar. Both of them killed someone very close to them in order to take their powerful devil fruits. Loki's origin story honestly almost feels like a callback to Blackbeard, down to the very description of being consumed by darkness. It's possible Oda is hinting at tying these two stories together in some way. It's particularly possible when you consider that Blackbeard is likely to get a third and final fruit to complete his trifecta. And many readers believe it will be an extremely powerful Zoan fruit to go along with his Logia and Paramecia. Now, I've long wondered what this Zoan could be, as it would likely be one that rivals the power of the Yami Yami no Mi and Gura Gura no Mi. And coincidentally, whatever fruit Loki has eaten seems very likely to be some extremely powerful mythical Zoan. One so strong, in fact, that Loki believes he can now become the sun god that ends the world. And if you consider Blackbeard's goals and what he symbolizes, a dark parallel to Luffy, well, Blackbeard eating a final fruit that is also a Zoan associated with becoming the sun god just like Luffy, would complete Blackbeard's image as Luffy's ultimate dark counterpart. And this possibility becomes particularly interesting when you consider that the fruit that Loki is said to have is the only other legendary devil fruit ever mentioned in One Piece, aside from the Nika fruit. So ultimately, Oda may have been saving the most powerful evil Zoan reserved for Blackbeard for the Elbaf arc, so that Blackbeard could acquire it at the start of the final saga. And this fruit is being introduced being wielded by this mighty warrior Loki, who will ultimately die at the end of the arc after playing out his role, so that Blackbeard can get this all-powerful fruit and complete his arsenal of almighty devil fruits. So Luffy, Zoro, Usopp, Kid, and Blackbeard. 5 possibilities for defeating Loki in Elbaf. Let me know who you think is most likely in the comments below, and if you want to hear a final 6th option, you can get my extended thoughts on my weekly podcast that just dropped by becoming a member or by supporting me on Patreon. Just hit the link in the description below.